Wogan jumped down from his box and ran to the carriage door. "Her Highness is ill," he cried in suspense. "Not the least bit in the world," returned Clementina, whose voice for once in a way jarred upon Wogan's ears. "Nothing short of a positive sickness could justify the delay." "What is it, then?" he asked curtly, almost roughly, of Mrs. Missett. "You carried a packet for Her Highness. It is left behind at the tavern." Wogan stamped impatiently on the ground. "And for this, for a petticoat or two, you hinder us," he cried in a heat. "There's no petticoat in the world, though it were so stiff with gold that it stood on end of itself, that's worth a single second of the next 48 hours. But it contains Her Highness's jewels." Wogan's impatience became an exasperation. Were all women at heart, then, no better than Indian squaws? A string of beads outweighed the sacrifices of friends and the chance of a crown. There was a blemish in his idol, since at all costs she must glitter. Wogan, however, was the master here. Page 206. "Her Highness must lose her jewels," he said roughly, and was turning away when Her Highness herself spoke. "You are unjust, my friend," she said. "I would lose them very willingly, were there a chance no one else would discover them. But there's no chance. The woman of the tavern will find the bundle, will open it, very likely she has done so already. We shall have all Innsbruck on our heels in half an hour." And for the first time that night Wogan heard her voice break, and grieved to know that the tears were running down her cheeks. He called to O'Toole. "Ride back to the tavern. Bring the packet without fail." O'Toole galloped off, and Gaydon drove the carriage to the side of the road. There was nothing to do but to wait, and they waited in silence, counting up the chances. There could be no doubt that the landlady, if once she discovered the jewels hidden away in a common packet of clothing, must suspect the travelers who had left them behind. She would be terrified by their value, she would be afraid to retain them lest harm should come to her, and all Innsbruck would be upon the fugitives' heels. They waited for half an hour, 30 minutes of gloom and despair. Clementina wept over this new danger which her comrades ran, Mrs. Missett wept for that her negligence was to blame, Gaydon sat on the box in the falling snow with his arms crossed upon his breast, and felt his head already, page 207, loose upon his shoulders. The only one of the party who had any comfort of that half-hour was Wogan. For he had been wrong, the chosen woman had no wish to glitter at all costs, though, to be sure, she could not help glittering with the refulgence of her great merits. His idol had no blemish. Wogan paced up and down the road, while he listened for O'Toole's return, and that thought cheated the time for him. At last he heard very faintly the sound of galloping hoofs below him on the road. He ran back to Gaydon. "It might be a courier to arrest us. If I shout, drive fast as you can to Nazareth, and from Nazareth to Italy." He hurried down the road and was hailed by O'Toole. "I have it," said he. Wogan turned and ran by O'Toole's stirrup to the carriage. "The landlady has a good conscience and sleeps well," said O'Toole. "I found the house dark and the doors shut. They were only secured, however, by a wooden beam dropped into a couple of sockets on the inside." "But how did you open them?" asked Clementina. "Your Highness, I have, after all, a pair of arms," said O'Toole. "I just pressed on the doors till the sockets gave?" "No, till the beam broke," said he, and Clementina laughed. Page 208. "That's my 6'4", said she. O'Toole did not understand. But he smiled with great condescension and dignity, and continued his story. I groped my way up the stairs into the room and found the bundle untouched in the corner. He handed it to the princess. Wogan sprang again onto the box, and Gaydon whipped up the horses. They reached the first posting stage at 2, the second at 4, the third at 6, and at each they wasted no time. All that night their horses strained up the mountain road amid the whirling sleet. At times the wind roaring down a gorge would set the carriage rocking, at times they stuck fast in drifts, and Wogan and Gaydon must leap from the box and plunging waist-deep in the snow, must drag at the horses and push at the wheels. The pace was too slow. Wogan seemed to hear on every gust of wind the sound of a galloping company. "We have lost 12 hours, more than 12 hours now," he repeated and repeated to Gaydon. All the way to Allah they would still be in the Emperor's territory. It needed only a single courier to gallop past them, and at either Roveredu or Trent they would infallibly be taken. Wogan fingered his pistols, straining his eyes backwards down the road. At daybreak the snow stopped, the carriage rolled on high among the mountains under a grey sky, and here and there, at a wind of the road, Wogan caught a glimpse of the towers and chimney-tops of Innsbruck, or had within his view a stretch of the, page 209, slope they had climbed. But there was never a black speck visible upon the white of the snow. As yet no courier was overtaking them, as yet Innsbruck did not know its captive had escaped. At 8 o'clock in the morning they came to Nazareth, and found their own Berlin ready harnessed at the posthouse door, the postilion already in his saddle, and Misset waiting with an uncovered head. "Her Highness will breakfast here, no doubt," said Gaydon. "Misset will have seen to it," cried Wogan, "that the Berlin is furnished. We can breakfast as we go." They waited no more than 10 minutes at Nazareth. The order of travelling was now changed. Wogan and Gaydon now travelled in the Berlin with Mrs. Misset and Clementina. Gaydon, being the oldest of the party, figured as the Count of Cerns, Mrs. Misset as his wife, Clementina as his niece, and Wogan as a friend of the family. O'Toole and Misset rode beside the carriage in the guise of servants. Thus they started from Nazareth, and had journeyed perhaps a mile when without so much as a moan Clementina swooned and fell forward into Wogan's arms. Mrs. Misset uttered a cry. Wogan clasped the princess to his breast. Her head fell back across his arm, pale as death, her eyes were closed, her bosom, strained against his, neither rose nor fell. "She has fasted all Lent," he said in a broken voice. "She has eaten nothing since we left Innsbruck." Page 210. Mrs. Misset burst into tears. She caught Clementina's hand and clasped it. She had no eyes but for her. With Gaydon it was different. Wogan was holding the princess in a clasp too lover-like, though, to be sure, it was none of his business. "We must stop the carriage," he said. "No," cried Wogan, desperately, "that we must not do," and he caught her still closer to him. He had a fear that she was dying. Even so, she should not be recaptured. Though she were dead, he would still carry her dead body into Bologna and lay it white and still before his king. Europe from London to the Bosphorus should know the truth of her and ring with the wonder of her, though she were dead. O'Toole, attracted by the noise of Mrs. Misset's lamentations, bent down over his horse's neck and looked into the carriage. "Her Highness is dead," he cried. "Drive on," replied Wogan, through his clenched teeth. Upon the other side of the carriage, Misset shouted through the window, "There is a spring by the roadside." "Drive on," said Wogan. Gaydon touched him on the arm. "You will stifle her, man." Wogan woke to a comprehension of his attitude, and placed Clementina back on her seat. Mrs. Misset by good fortune had a small bottle of Carmelite water in her pocket. She held it to the princess's nostrils, who in a little opened her eyes and saw her, page 211, companions in tears about her, imploring her to wake. "It is nothing," she said. "Take courage, my poor marmozets, and with a smile she added, "There's my 6'4" with the tears in his eyes. Did ever a woman have such friends?" The sun came out in the sky as she spoke. They had topped the pass and were now driving down towards Italy. There was snow about them still on the mountainsides and deep in drifts upon the roads. The air was musical with the sound of innumerable freshets. They could be seen leaping and sparkling in the sunlight. The valleys below were green with the young green of spring, and the winds were tempered with the warmth of Italy. A like change came upon the fugitives. They laughed, where before they had wept. From under the seat they pulled out chickens which Misset had cooked with his own hands at Nazareth, bottles of the wine of Saint Laurent, and bread, and Wogan allowed a halt long enough to get water from a spring by the roadside. "There is no salt," said Gaydon. "Indeed there is," replied Misset, indignant at the aspersion on his catering. "I have it in my tobacco box." He took his tobacco box from his pocket and passed it into the carriage. Clementina made sandwiches and passed them out to the horsemen. The chickens turned out to be old cocks, impervious to the soundest tooth. No one minded except Misset, who had brought them. The jolts of the carriage became matter for a jest. They picnicked, page 212, with the merriment of children, and finally O'Toole, to show his contempt for the Emperor, fired off both his loaded pistols in the air. At that Wogan's anxiety returned. He blazed up into anger. He thrust his head from the window. "Is this your respect for Her Highness?" he cried. "Is this your consideration?" "Nay," interposed Clementina, "you shall not chide my 6'4". "But he is mad, your Highness." "I don't say but what a trifle of madness is salt to a man, but O'Toole's clean daft to be firing his pistols off to let the whole world know who we are. Here are we not 6 stages from Innsbruck, and already we have lost 12 hours. When? Last night, before we left Innsbruck, between the time when you escaped from the villa and when I joined you in the avenue. I climbed out of the window to descend as I had entered, but the sentinel had returned. I waited on the window ledge crouched against the wall until he should show me his back. After 5 minutes or so he did. He stamped on the snow and marched up the lane. I let myself down and hung by my hands, but he turned on his beat before I could drop. He marched back. I clung to the ledge, thinking that in the darkness he would pass on beneath me and never notice. He did not notice, but my fingers were frozen and numbed with the cold. I felt them slipping, I could cling no longer, and I fell. Luckily I fell just as he, page 213, passed beneath me. I dropped feet foremost upon his shoulders, and he went down without a cry. I left him lying stunned there on the snow, but he will be found, or he will recover. Either way our escape will be discovered, and no later than this morning. Nay, it must already have been discovered. Already Innsbruck's bells are ringing the alarm, already the pursuit is begun, and he leaned his head from the window and cried, "Faster! Faster!" O'Toole, for his part, shouted, "Trinkgeld!" It was the only word of German which he knew. "But," said he, "there was a Saracen lady I learned about at school who travelled over Europe and found her lover in an alehouse in London, with no word but his name to help her over the road. Sure, it would be a strange thing if I couldn't travel all over Germany with the help of Trinkgeld." The word certainly had its efficacy with the postilion. "Trinkgeld," cried O'Toole, and the berlin rocked and lurched and leaped down the pass. The snow was now less deep, the drifts fewer. The road wound along a mountainside. At one window rose the rock, from the other the travelers looked down hundreds of feet to the bed of the valley in the boiling torrent of the Adige. It was a mere narrow ribbon of a road made by the Romans, without a thought for the convenience of travelers in a later day, and as the carriage turned a corner, O'Toole, mounted on his horse, saw ahead a heavy cart crawling up towards them. The carter saw the, page 214, berlin thundering down towards him behind its 4 maddened horses, and he drew his cart to the inside of the road against the rock. The postilion tugged at his reins. He had not sufficient interval of space to check his team, he threw a despairing glance at O'Toole. It seemed impossible the berlin could pass. There was no use to cry out. O'Toole fell behind the carriage with his mind made up. He looked down the precipice. He saw in his imagination the huge carriage with its tangled, struggling horses falling sheer into the foam of the river. He could not ride back to Bologna with that story to tell. He and his horse must take the same quick, steep road. The postilion drove so close to the cart that he touched it as he passed. "We are lost," he shouted in an agony, and O'Toole saw the hind wheel of the berlin slip off the road and revolve for the fraction of a second in the air. He was already putting his horse at the precipice as though it was a ditch to be jumped, when the berlin made, to his astonished eyes, an effort to recover its balance like a live thing. It seemed to spring sideways from the brink of the precipice. It not only seemed, it did spring, and O'Toole, drawing rein, in the great revulsion of his feelings, saw, as he rocked unsteadily in his saddle, the carriage tearing safe and unhurt down the very center of the road. O'Toole set his spurs to his horse and galloped after it. The postilion looked back and laughed. "Trinkgeld," he cried.